Very warm welcome. What we're going to cover is an overview of the requirements of the cybersecurity Jersey law, and then we'll go on and have some specific discussions on three areas in particular. So the risks that we have, cyber risks that we have, and what we mean by significance, incident significance, so what's a significant incident for reporting. How we want to implement instant reporting in practice, how that will work, and finally how we can support you as OESs with guidance and standards where that's necessary, where that's helpful, and talk about the approach that we can take there. We'll have some time for feedback to get everybody's views and opinions on all of that, and we will also talk through what happens next in terms of implementing the law. If anyone has any questions as we go through, please do raise your hand, just with a proviso that we're recording the first part, of course, or you can put a message in chat. I'm aware that there are a few people whose organisations may block the chat, in which case I would say just raise your hand. Or indeed speak. We're not blocking the microphones, so you can jump in if you want to. So, assuming there are no questions there, we'll go on. Tell you this. So, facilitators, myself, Carla, Paul, I mentioned, and Elizabeth Bompier from the Government of Jersey is going to join us, I think, partway through. So, we've got the four of us here today. And so, talk a little bit about the law. Most people, I think, on this call will have some familiarity with this because, of course, it's been discussed quite significantly locally, and there were two public consultations, as part of the development of the legislation. So where we are now, having started this process really with the government's cybersecurity strategy in 2017, having done those two consultations and draft law, this has now been to the State Assembly, who adopted the legislation in January. And that step having now been completed, there are a couple more steps that need to be undertaken before the legislation can be put into effect. It needs to go before the Privy Council for royal assent, and it needs to be registered in Jersey's Royal Court. So we're expecting that to happen over the next 3 to 6 months. Once that has happened, the law would then be enacted by ministerial order. So the ministers have indicated to us at the moment their intention is to bring this in as quickly as possible, and therefore we expect phase one of the law to come in really as soon as the law's enacted, and that will cover the establishment of JCSC, formal establishment of JCSC in law, the functions and governance of the Director of JCSC and JCSC itself, and that we expect to happen pretty quickly. The current intent is that there will then be a wait of about 3 months to give OES organisations a bit of time to get familiar with the requirements and comfortable with their obligations under the law before the OES obligations will be brought in. If anyone does not have their microphone on mute, could I ask you just to put your microphone on mute, please? We can do it from this end, but it's easy for you to do. Thank you very much. So that'll be about 3 months after, based on current political guidance. Of course, that is subject to what ministers decide to do after the election, but that's currently our expectation. So really, it'll be Q4 and when the obligations on operators of essential services formally come into effect. So what are those obligations? What does the law actually require? What's it asking of us all? So the law places obligations on several different parties. It places some obligations on the minister. This is in case it is the Minister for Sustainable Economic Development or the Deputy Minister. And that is to maintain a list of operators of essential services, or OESs. And it also gives the Minister the ability to impose civil financial penalties to a maximum of £10,000 for a contravention of the law. That does come with a proviso. Our goal throughout this, the government's goal and policy objective throughout this, has not been to create a regulatory regime or one that is penal in nature. It's to create a regime that is supportive and encouraging and helps deliver the cultural change and engagement that's necessary to manage cyber risk effectively. So those penalties are not designed to be overly onerous. They're designed to be quite proportionate, and that role is fulfilled by the minister. The law has requirements on JCSC as well, so it asks us to act as something called a single point of contact, or SPOC, on cybersecurity, and a computer security incident response team, or CSIRT, for Jersey. So what those mean in practice, SPOC has not been the only point of contact for cybersecurity. It's not our intention to be a post box. If there are people you talk to directly, that is absolutely fine. The intention there is to really reflect the global environment for cybersecurity, where there's a well-recognised challenge in that one country, when it wants to notify somebody in another country of a cybersecurity issue, often doesn't know who to talk to because there's a myriad of different bodies and organisations who deal with cybersecurity. So what this is saying is there's going to be one point of contact for people outside of the jurisdiction when they want to contact the jurisdiction about cybersecurity issues, and effectively we will triage any issues that come through that way. So we'll be that single point of contact. And that reflects EU and other legislation as well, so things like NIS and NIS2 directive, where very similar language is used. And the Computer Security Incident Response Team, that very much does what it says on the tin. It's about being the organisation that's tasked with coordinating a response to major cyber incidents across the island. It gives us an obligation to increase the level of cyber resilience in Jersey, and of course to receive mandatory reports of significant cyber incidents. There is no point somebody reporting these if we don't receive them and action them. It also gives us an ability to monitor and scan and analyse information to identify threats, and that might be publicly available information. It might also be, and is currently, information on the public internet space in Jersey. So we don't and will not scan or attempt to scan or access inside anybody's private networks, but we do currently, through third parties and potentially directly in the future, scan the public internet space to look for vulnerabilities and issues so that we can notify organisations of potential problems before they turn into an incident. It gives us an obligation to provide guidance and standards to help organisations to improve their security. One of the goals of this session is to really help us to understand where that will be most helpful. Yeah. It allows us to facilitate confidential sharing of threat information, vulnerabilities, incidents, and this is really, really important because effective information sharing is what allows us to protect the island from incidents as they occur. And finally, it gives us requirements to maintain independence, so operational independence from government and separate IT systems and other such precautions. And of course, that is to ensure that where people want to share information with us, they can trust us to keep that information within JCSC, so we won't be sharing that back with government, regulators, law enforcement, others. That very much is up to you. We're a trusted point of reporting, and our goal is to help and support you to respond to your incident and to protect the jurisdiction. There are certain circumstances where we would share information. Usually that is restricted to areas like national security or safeguarding, where there are specific legal obligations that would come first. But very much the goal is to build an environment of trust. The law, of course, also requires obligations from operators of essential services. There's really three main things to think about here. The first one is a requirement to register as an operator of essential services with JCSC. I mentioned the Minister had an obligation to maintain the list of OES. The Minister has indicated that she would like to delegate that to JCSC. So we will maintain that register, which makes sense as we would have to process the information anyway. So you'll have to register as an OES, and we will help you to do that. You can pre-register now. I'll come on to that in a moment. There is a requirement to implement appropriate and proportionate cybersecurity measures. I appreciate that's a very high-level requirement, as it is a high-level requirement in the data protection law, and we'll come on to that and what it means in a moment. And also there is a requirement to report significant cyber incidents to JCSC within 24 hours of becoming aware, and that is 24 hours of becoming aware that you have an incident and that it's significant. A lot of thought's been given to that time reporting period. The original consultation was to 48 hours, but the feedback from ministers and particularly from scrutiny was that actually if we're going to do this, we should do it properly and be as tight as we reasonably can. So 24 hours is the decision that was made. So that's a brief summary of the law and the law's requirements. Of course, the full law is available for reading online, and I believe Carla has just popped a message with the link to the legislation in the chat for anybody who would like to read the full law. It's also on our website. A few things worth noting that the law does not do, not intended to do. The first one is it doesn't make JCSC a regulatory body. We are not here to be a regulator. We're here to be an advisory and support body, so a critical friend to you. And that is to, of course, build that culture of sharing and trust so that we can actually be there and support you without fear of any consequence or implications in seeking our help. So we're not regulatory. It doesn't give us any power to issue fines, penalties, public statements, or any of the things that you would normally see from a regulator, therefore. So again, this is about protecting your data and building that trust. So we don't do any of those things. We won't do any of those things. It also doesn't impose any new requirements on OESs to notify customers of an incident. So this was a proposal that was in the original draft of the legislation pre-consultation. The feedback from the consultation and reflections on this were that actually in terms of notifying customers of a cyber incident, this is already largely dealt with through the obligation to notify data subjects in the event of a data breach. And in the event of a cybersecurity incident that wasn't a data breach, it's very hard to say whether notifying customers would be helpful or not to the customer. And therefore, the view was that this should be left with the organisations concerned to use their discretion as to what extent they communicate with their customers. So that is not a requirement. It also doesn't impose any fees. So, of course, we have the ability to raise revenue through things like sponsorship or shared costs, but we won't be imposing any statutory charges. There's no annual fee and there's no fee for using our services. And the final one to note is there's no mandate for reporting if you are not an OES. If you're not an OES, this is still voluntary, but I would highlight that it is very good practice to do so, and we would encourage people to report significant incidents, whether or not they're an OES, and actually not to wait for the law to come in force, because of course you can do this today. So for more information then, I mentioned the link to the legislation, but you can also find more information here. So our information hub on the cyber law at jcsc.je/cyberlaw, that's been set up, and that's where we're going to be collating together all the information that we're producing to support you in implementing obligations under the law and understanding how you can report to us and fulfill those obligations. And secondly, I mentioned registering as an operator of essential services. You can pre-register today. We encourage you to do so. This means letting us know, giving us the information that you will be required to provide as an OES under the law by giving us this information. Now it's very simple information and takes a couple of minutes to fill in. We know who you are, we know that you expect to be an OES, and we can engage and communicate with you as we go through this process, and we can support you in the interim period. So I would encourage everybody to pre-register. If you do pre-register, it doesn't make you an OES. That doesn't happen until the law comes in. And if you subsequently decide you're not an OES, that is absolutely fine. However, once you have pre-registered and the law does come in, we won't ask you to provide all that information again. When those obligations come into effect, we will email you and say, would you like your pre-registration information to stand as your registration under the law? So it'll be simple and straightforward to transition that into a registration under the legislation when that comes into effect. So I would encourage you to make a note of those and to go and have a look and consider pre-registering if you've not already done so. So I'm going to stop for a minute, a moment, just to have something to drink, because I've been talking for a while. And we're going to talk about three of the key areas that there are that arise from this legislation. So the first area I want to talk about is the risks that we have in terms of cybersecurity and the significance of incidents. So I mentioned the requirement to report significant incidents. The question is, so what is significance to us? And this is a really important question for us to have clarity on. So firstly, what do we mean by a cyber risk? We really mean by there something that could happen that would have a negative impact if it materialised. That's all we mean here. If it happened, something bad would result. And if that meets the definition of a cyber incident in the law, then that's a cyber risk. So what is a cyber incident? And this is what it says in the legislation. It means an event that arises from a cyber threat, whether accidental or malicious. I won't read all of this, so please do make a note, summarise it. It involves unauthorised access, attempted unauthorised access, or it compromises one of these 5 things: confidentiality, integrity, availability, authenticity, and non-repudiation, but basically computer systems or data. Now, it may mean you may know what all of those terms mean, or you may not know what all of those terms mean, and that's definitely something that we can discuss in the discussions. We also have some guidance on this that is online and in our annual booklet, which we can provide. So those are the requirements, but D is also important. So D is it must have a negative impact on the systems, the technology, information, or the person. So if it doesn't have a negative effect, it is not an incident. It is not an incident under the law. It's just something that could have happened. So we are really interested in something that relates to cybersecurity and that has a real life impact. That makes it an incident. It doesn't make it a significant one. So the next question we need to think about is, what do we actually mean by significance? Because the requirement is to report a significant incident. And thank you, Carl has just shared the link to the information that explains those 5 terms. So what do we mean by significance? Significance is about how big that impact is. I mentioned it has to have an impact. How big the impact is what determines significance. It's not defined as a term in the law, but there are specific factors that the law says do have to be taken into account. So this is what the law says. It says that an OES must notify the director of an incident the OES considers has had or is likely to have a significant impact on the cyber resilience of the OES or on the essential service that the OES provides. So on you as an organisation or on the service that made you an essential OES provider. And in doing that, there are some specific considerations that the law says you have to take into account. One and that is in determining the purposes of paragraph 1, whether it's significant, the OES must have regard to the following matters, which are the number of users affected by the disruption of the essential service, the duration of the cyber incident, and the geographical area affected by the cyber incident. Now, if you put that through the lens of the 5 terms I mentioned previously, you can see that this maps quite heavily towards availability related incidents. And that's understandable because, of course, the goal here is to build resilience for services as an island, make sure we protect the services of islanders first and foremost. So that is quite heavily weighted towards availability, but the other 4 matter too. So one of the key questions is, how do we define significance? How do you define significance? What guidance do we need to help you to do that? And therefore, what incidents would you report? And these are the questions that we're going to be asking. And what I'd like to ask everybody to do is, please, if you could screenshot these questions. We'll have 3 sets of questions and we'll break everybody up into 3 groups to discuss one of these areas. So please screenshot each of these. I'll tell you which slides to screenshot. If you then have any questions, we can also pop stuff in the group chat before we break into groups. Or if you're stuck, email us and we can send some information over to you. But please just screenshot these questions. So what's the key cyber risk for the sector? So what do we feel are the key risks? It's really important that we're talking about incidents and impact. We do it in the context of risks that matter. Are they similar or different? What would a significant incident look like? So what do we think significant would be? And what factors beyond those in the legislation would you take into account in determining if an incident is significant to you? And that will really help us in setting our guidance for you. So those are the questions that we're asking around cyber risks and significance. Okay. I'll move on to topic 2. Implementing incident reporting in practice. So we've talked about when you might have to report an incident and the need to understand significance. The next step, of course, is to implement a process that allows you to do so. So what does the law require from incident reporting? It requires you to report, let's actually read the bottom bit first, for the OES must give notification required as soon as reasonably practicable and no later than 24 hours. That's after become aware of the occurrence of the incident, and that it's had or likely to have a significant impact on the continuity of services. And when you do that notification, it asks you to share some specific information. So to the extent they are within your knowledge, it's not asking you to go and do any new research or to find out information you already know. It's just asking you to share the information that you do know. So your name and what the service is that you provide, so we know who you were working with, the time and date an incident occurred, very often, just now, the current status of the incident, which means is this an open, ongoing issue? Is it escalating? Is it closed and resolved? The duration of the incident, so has it been going on for months? Did it just start today? Yeah. The threat actor, if known, and a threat actor is the person who did it to you. So if it's an intentional incident, then somebody will have done something to try and cause your organisation harm. In many cases, you won't know who that is, and the law's not suggesting that you try to find out. It's only saying that if you do know the answer, so for example, if it's ransomware and you know which group it is that's attacked you, that you should share that information. Information about the nature of the impact of the incident, and it's not specific as to how much information here, so it's really to encourage you to be sort of open and transparent with information that will help us to help you. Information about the impact or likely impact outside Jersey, and that's really important to us because part of our role is to coordinate with other bodies elsewhere in the world, and where there's a potential impact outside of the island, by getting ahead of that and talking to them, we can very often reduce the impact on you and on the island. And finally, other information that you consider may be helpful to the director. That's not that the director considers you should provide, that's that you feel should be helpful. So that's an open door to provide other information. And that's what it asks. Now, in terms of JCSC, we thought this through. How do we want to ask for this information? And we're going to be very open about it. So you're not required to follow any particular process. You can copy us in an email you're sending internally or to a regulator. You could fill in our web form that we already have a web form for reporting incidents. You could email us, you could pop round, you could pick up the phone. So it's very much up to you how you provide that information to us. One other thing to mention is we do, of course, classify incidents, try and work out which are important to us. This is very much based on what happens in the UK and elsewhere as well. So we classify incidents to work out whether something is minor or major in terms of impact. You may wish to screenshot this slide as well. It is useful. It's also on our website. And basically, if it is a 4 or 5, it's very unlikely to be significant. If it's a 1 or 2, it is quite likely to be significant. And of course, there's an area in the middle where there's some discretion. And what we'll probably do once we have the input from these workshops is we'll look to review and update this classification guide as well to try and make sure that it maps closely to the law. This is what we use internally to work out the level of response that we should have. So questions on embedding incident reporting. If you could please do take a screenshot of this slide. So this is the second set of questions for incident reporting. So the questions that we're asking are, what processes do you have in place to report cybersecurity incidents? What approval or oversight maybe has to take place in your organisation? How does it interact with regulatory obligations? So you may have reporting requirements, for example, to a regulator, maybe you're a regulated financial institution or a telecoms provider or a public body, you have accountability through to the government, or maybe it's a data incident and you have to report to the Information Commissioner. So you may have regulatory obligations that interact, and you may want to report it as a crime to the police. And finally, how would you balance that need for quick reporting and the need to protect commercial interests? So, your own interests, making sure that you can manage that incident and resolve it, as well as spend time on reporting it and sharing it. So those are the questions that we're asking to be considered under Group 2. I'll just give everybody a moment to make sure you've got screenshots if you need it. The final question that we're asking in these sessions is, what guidance and standards do we need to produce to support you? So to come back to the legislation and the requirements of the legislation, it says that an OES must implement measures that are appropriate and proportionate. It talks about that in the context of identifying cyber threats, reducing the risk of incidents, preparing for incidents, and ensuring continuity of the service. It also says that the measures must ensure a level of security of network and information systems and operational technology that are appropriate to the threat and the risk posed by that threat. So very much it is not telling you that you must do specific things, it is telling you that you must have appropriate measures, so those that are appropriate and proportionate based on the threats and the risks to your organisation. And this is the one area where it says the director must issue guidance. So the expectation of the law is that we will definitely issue guidance on this section, including how to assess the appropriate level of security. And your input to this is really key, because that's going to help us to make sure we get that guidance right, and that guidance will in turn help you. So those are the requirements of the law. Of course, there's a lot of guidance and standards already out there, and one of the things we definitely don't want to do is duplicate, reinvent the wheel, or create conflicting requirements in different jurisdictions in which local businesses operate. So to give you an example of some of the things you may already have come across that are already out there at the moment, Cyber Essentials, very common, supported by the UK government, by the Jersey government, expected for government suppliers by both. And that just has 5 key controls which you can implement relatively quickly for SMEs to ensure a baseline level of security, and that's a really good place to start if you're not sure where to start. Cyber Governance Code of Practice is brand new from the UK. That's very good. If you're a governed organisation, you have a board or an operating committee, that's a really good way to look at, how should we look at cybersecurity? Do we have the right controls in place? ISO 20001 is the sort of de facto, is the international standard on security incident management. Not security incident management. That's another one, on security risk management. And that's very, very common, particularly across companies operating in the UK and Europe. And the cyber assessment framework, again from NCSC, is very common, particularly in what we call CNI organisations or critical national infrastructure organisations. So those are a few of the ones that are out there, but there are plenty of others out there as well. You may use some of these already, you may not use some of these already. Our goal is to try and make sure we do things that are helpful in terms of guidance and standards and not duplicatory. So the questions we'd like to ask, and again, if you could screenshot this slide, please, for Group 3. What guidance and standards are needed to help you to implement the law? So what's currently used in your organisation? Do you use some or all of these already? Is there existing guidance and standards that is suitable for organisations at a Jersey scale? We recognise that organisations in Jersey are often smaller than elsewhere. Do they provide sufficient clarity? Do you have the answers there? What does appropriate and proportionate mean to you? It means something slightly different to every organisation. We want to make sure we issue the best guidance that we can on this. So understanding what you feel this means is a great place for us to start. So please give that some consideration. And where you see any gaps or overlaps, so is there existing duplication we should be aware of? Are there areas where maybe you need or want some additional guidance? And finally, is there other information that you feel that you would need to make sure that you do have the ability to comply? So those are our 3 areas for discussion. What we're going to do at that point is to break into 3 groups, and we will consider each of these areas. Now, Carla is our technical wizard on this call, so Carla will be breaking everybody into 3 groups. So hopefully everybody has a screenshot of the questions. I will go back over them in a second for you, and we will have somebody in each group to help or support you, is what we're going to try to do. But really, we want you to have that conversation and then come back to us with those answers. We'll then bring everybody back together and we'll ask for some feedback from each group. If as you go through you want to make your own notes, you have your own questions, you have other things that you want to share, please do write them down, because we're interested in all of that. We're very much here to learn. So before we break into groups, I'll just go over those 3 areas again. So the first one, sector cyber risks and incident significance, and the questions are these ones. Please make sure you have a screenshot. The second one, implementing incident reporting in practice, and the questions are these ones. Take a screenshot. And the third one, what guidance and standards are needed, the questions are these ones, if you'd like to take a screenshot.